everyone, I'm Tabitha, and today we're talking book recommendations. If you watched yesterday's video on reading statistics, you already know that in 2019 I read 139 books, spanning a variety of genres. You also know that more than half of what I read I loved and rated 4 or 5 stars. Now, if you're interested in more details about how that breaks down, don't forget to check out yesterday's video, which I will drop in the descriptions. But today, I decided to try an interesting take on book recommendations. Sure, I could do a video or a blog post like I did in 2018 where I just tell you what books I rated 5 stars. But 139 books means there's a lot of good stuff out there, and I don't want you to miss any of it. So instead, I compiled all my book recommendations of the books that I think you are not going to want to miss that I read in 2019. I compiled them all by genre, and I'm bringing them to you today. In fact, I'm bringing you my top 4 recommendations in each genre. In the description, I am going to put helpful timestamps that will help you jump to a genre. My suggestion would be watch genres that you regularly read or that you've been thinking about trying, because these are 4 or 5 star books, meaning some of them are going to transcend genre and be a great one for you to try for the first time. I should mention these books were not all published in 2019, I just read them in 2019. When I'm telling you a little about the book, I will make sure to tell you the author and the year it was published. If you have any trouble finding one of the books, you'll be able to head over to my Amazon list, which I will also drop into the comments, and the Amazon list has buy links for each one of the titles. All right, here we go. First up, my science fiction recommendations. Science fiction, as you probably already know, is defined as the genre that introduces futuristic and/or technological advances to our world. Now, there's a big range of science fiction out there. Some of them are very mild, introducing only 1 or 2 small elements, while some are entirely new worlds that we have no access to. So I will tell you a little bit more about each of these science fiction books as we go. My first recommendation for science fiction is This Never Happened by R. Tim Morris. This book happens to be written for the age category adult. It is published by Empire Stamp in 2019. This book is what I would call a mild science fiction. It's not going to introduce an incredible amount of technology or take you to a brand new world. In fact, it's written as though it's taking place right here on Earth. But it does take that great blend of real life stuff and impossible stuff and wrap them up into one incredibly well-written story. My next science fiction recommendation is The God Queen by M.L. Tishner. This is age category, I would call it new adult. It's right there between young adult and adult. It is independently published in 2019, and this one is what I would call pretty high science fiction. This is an epic space story with a reluctant hero, some great characters. This is going to take you right into the middle of outer space, introduce a bunch of technology our characters need to survive, and give you a great story. Next up in science fiction recommendations, I Hope You Find Me by Trish Marie Dawson. This one was written for adults and independently published in 2012. This story is your basic post-apocalyptic story, but with an interesting twist that it seems as though your main character's mistakes are what's driving the plot. This had great characters and a great storyline and was highly recommended. My last science fiction recommendation is Swipe by Evan Engler. This is a young adult science fiction published by Thomas Nelson in 2012, and this one is a dystopia, which means it's going to take a world that seems like it could be perfect and highlight all the problems with it. This one is great for big lessons about government overreaching and does include a technology we do not currently have. So, my 4 recommendations for science fiction that you don't want to miss are This Never Happened, The God Queen, I Hope You Find Me, and Swipe. Next up, my fantasy recommendations. As you know, the fantasy genre is defined by taking impossible or improbable things and throwing them into your stories. That's, again, a pretty broad category. In 2019, as you'll already know if you watched my video yesterday, I read more fantasy than any other genre. So for this reason, I've decided to break my fantasy recommendations further down into age categories. Let's start with my top 4 recommendations for young adult fantasy. First up, A Soul Reclaimed by Shayna Grissom. This one is published by Sands Press in 2019. In this one, you get to follow well-written characters in their journey through the 7 layers of hell. The second young adult fantasy recommendation is Every Day by David Leviathan. This was published by Knopf Books for Young Readers in 2012. This one is a unique story about a main character who wakes up in a different body every day. My third recommendation for young adult fantasy is Heartless by Marissa Meyer. This was published by Fuel and Friends in 2016. It's the story of the girl who will later become the Queen of Hearts. And my last young adult fantasy story I don't think you're going to want to miss is Reverie by Ryan LaSala. This is published by Sourcebooks Fire and just came out in December of 2019. It's a well-written magic story about dreams that come to life, and it features an adorable LGBTQ romance arc. So these are my 4 recommendations if you're looking for great young adult fantasy stories: A Soul Reclaimed, Every Day, Heartless, and Reverie. Next up, my new adult and adult fantasy recommendations. The Green Mile by Stephen King. This one is written for adults. It was published by Penguin Signette in 1996. This story, if you haven't already read it, is a tale of supernatural proportions taking place on E-Block, where convicted killers await the death penalty. My second adult fantasy recommendation is Blood Awakens by Jessica Willis. This one is independently published in 2019. It's an urban fantasy following characters as they learn to deal with their new supernatural powers. My third adult fantasy recommendation is Long Grows the Dark by Catherine Labate. This is published by Labate Publishing in 2018, and it's a refreshing magic system and a scary villain. My last adult fantasy recommendation is A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. This one was published by Bantam in 1996, and if you haven't already read it, this is an epic fantasy that will bring you into an entirely new world where the characters are going to seem real. So the top 4 adult fantasy books I don't think you're going to want to miss: The Green Mile, Blood Awakens, Long Grows the Dark, and A Game of Thrones. My mystery thriller recommendations. Mystery thriller, as you probably already know, is a genre that's classified by a heightened feeling of suspense, anticipation, surprise, or anxiety when you're reading. Sometimes they can be set in modern day, and they don't have to be. All mystery thriller is categorized by that feeling. If you watched yesterday's video, you already know mystery thriller was the second most common category for me in 2019, so again I'm breaking these down even further by age category. Let's start with my mystery thriller recommendations for young adults or middle grades. First up, Hunting Annabelle by Wendy Hurd. This one is targeted towards young adults. It was published by Mira Books in 2018. This one features an unreliable narrator who's going to bring the creepy level of this book to all new heights in this thriller that will certainly have you on the edge of your seats. Next up, The Deceiver by Kristen Simmons. This one was also written for young adults and published by Tor Teen in 2019. This follows teenagers at a con artist school in a fast-moving book full of mystery and intrigue. The third mystery thriller young adult recommendation is Expelled by James Patterson. This was published by Little Brown & Company in 2017 and follows a group of teenagers who are anything but perfect as they try to defend their honor when they're accused of a crime. My last mystery thriller recommendation that was not written for adults is actually a middle grades book. It's called The Screaming Staircase by Jonathan Stroud, and it was published by Doubleday Children's in 2013. This book is the first in a series that follows a group of ghost-hunting children as they solve mysteries in London. So my 4 recommendations for either young adults or middle grades in the mystery thriller category are Hunting Annabelle, The Deceivers, Expelled, and The Screaming Staircase. Next up, my recommendations for mystery thriller in the age category of adult. My first recommendation is Shadow of Doubt by S.L. Beaumont. This was published by Paperback Writers Publishing in 2019. It is a solid mystery that follows an adult main character who still grows and learns like you normally see in young adult, and the mystery is highly satisfying. Next up, The Black Book by James Patterson. This was published by Century in 2017. It's a mystery full of twists and turns that will definitely keep you guessing, and it's one of Patterson's best books. My third adult mystery thriller recommendation is Mr. Mercedes by Stephen King. This one was published by Gallery Books in 2014, and if you haven't read it yet, you should know that this one introduces you to tons of characters that you will absolutely love, who are all popping up to battle an evil that will span a full trilogy. And my last mystery thriller recommendation for adults is Sometimes I Lie by Alice Feeney. This one was published by Flatiron Books in 2017. It is a psychological thriller that takes an entire book for you to unravel, and even longer for you to wrap your head around. So my 4 mystery thriller recommendations for adults are Shadow of Doubt, The Black Book, Mr. Mercedes, and Sometimes I Lie. Next up, I take a look at contemporary stories. Contemporary stories are stories that belong to or occur in the present. They could be happening right now. They have no magical elements, no science fiction or technological elements, no monsters. They're just real stories about real people. I read a lot of really good contemporary books in 2019, so I'm splitting these recommendations into those written for young adults and those written for adults. First up, young adult contemporary. Zero by Tom Levine. This was published by Random House Books for Young Readers in 2012. This follows a sarcastic, angsty teen girl who has to figure out what to do with her life after high school. She is one of my favorite characters. Next up, Suicide Notes from Beautiful Girls by Lynn Weingarten. This was published by Simon Pulse in 2015. This book features morally questionable characters leading the charge in investigating a suicide. This story definitely has mystery thriller elements, but it is classified as contemporary. My next young adult contemporary recommendation is Turtles All the Way Down by John Green. This was published by Dutton Books for Young Readers in 2017. The main character here is a teenager with anxiety and OCD, and it turns out to be one of the best books I've read with that kind of main character. It does have mystery elements as the teenager attempts to get answers to a story about a fugitive billionaire. My last young adult contemporary recommendation is Finding Audrey by Sophie Kinsella. This was published by Ember in 2015. It's a realistic look at social anxiety and the kids who battle it, all wrapped up in a wonderful fiction story with romance elements. So my 4 young adult contemporary recommendations are Zero, Suicide Notes from Beautiful Girls, Turtles All the Way Down, and Finding Audrey. Next up, my contemporary adult recommendations. These books are contemporary stories that were written with adults in mind. My first recommendation is A Man Called Uwe by Friedrich Bachmann. This story was published by Washington Square Press in 2012. It's a lovable book with big messages about what makes life worth living. Next up, A Spark of Light by Jodi Picoult. This was published by Ballantine Books in 2018. It is a hard look at abortion and society in a well-researched fiction novel. My next adult contemporary recommendation is For One More Day by Mitch Albom. This book was published by Hachette Books in 2006. It examines relationships to bring you inspirational lessons. Mitch Albom's books usually have a religious undertone to them, and this one is no exception. My last contemporary adult recommendation is Jenny of Lebanon by Gabrielle Alexa. This was published by Sisyphean Publishing in 2019. It features beautiful language and an emotional story packed into a novella that you're going to love. So my contemporary adult books that you are not going to want to miss that I read in 2019, A Man Called Uwe, A Spark of Light, For One More Day, and Jenny of Lebanon. Next up, my historical fiction recommendations. Historical fiction is a story that's entirely made up, but it borrows characteristics of a particular time period. Of course, since we've lived a lot of time periods, that means that these could span a lot of different places and times. So I'll try to tell you a little about what time period they are representing. First up, The Book Thief by Markus Zusak. This was a young adult intended book published by Alfred A. Knopf in 2007. The story in this one happens to be a little girl in Nazi Germany whose life was forever changed by a book. This story also features an incredible narrator. My next historical fiction recommendation is I Am Mercy by Mandy Lynn. This one was published for young adults by Stone Ridge Books in 2015. This story is set in 14th century France, and it's a unique take on afterlife and living forever at a price. My next recommendation in historical fiction is The Magic Strings of Frankie Presto by Mitch Albom. This was published for adults by Harper in 2012. It's a unique narrator bringing us the magic story of Frankie, the greatest guitar player who ever lived. This one is going to span a lot of years, and it's definitely going to include musical guest stars, I guess you could say, that you have heard of. The last one is The Raven's Tale by Kat Winters. This was written for young adults and published by Amulet Books in 2019. This is the dark tale of Edgar Allan Poe and his muse. So my 4 historical fiction recommendations for you are The Book Thief, I Am Mercy, The Magic Strings of Frankie Presto, and The Raven's Tale. Next up, nonfiction, or my true story recommendations. I definitely didn't read a lot of nonfiction in 2019, but I did read some that you don't want to miss. First up, Confessions of a Bad Ugly Singer by Colette McLafferty. This was published by New Haven Publishing in 2018, and it's the story of the singer who was sued for being in a Pink cover band. My next nonfiction recommendation is I'll Be There For You by Kelsey Miller. This one was published by Hanover Square Press in 2018. It's the story behind the long-running Friends TV show that began in 1994. The third nonfiction recommendation I have for you is Capital Gains, Smart Things I Learned Doing Stupid Stuff by Chip Gaines. This was published by Thomas Nelson in 2017. It's the story behind the entrepreneur with the dream and the hammer. The last nonfiction recommendation I have for you is I See Life Through Rosé-Colored Glasses by Lisa Scottoline. This was published by St. Martin's Press in 2018. It's a hilarious look at life as a woman told through a series of essays. So my 4 nonfiction books that I don't think you're going to want to miss if you like nonfiction are Confessions of a Bad Ugly Singer, I'll Be There For You, Capital Gains, Smart Things I Learned Doing Stupid Stuff, and I See Life Through Rosé-Colored Glasses. For my last category, I want to talk about various genres that I don't really read enough of to have 4 recommendations in. If you watched yesterday's video, you already know that just because I don't read a genre all the time doesn't mean that I can't be an unbiased judge or find the book that I love. So that being said, here are my recommendations for other genres. In the romance genre, my recommendation is Hearts, Strings, and Other Breakable Things by Jacqueline Firkins. This one was actually published for young adults by HMH Books for Young Readers in 2019. It's a feel-good, adorable romance that happens to pack some serious heat. You get some cute lessons from it and that happy for now ending that you're probably looking for. In the category of horror, subcategory screenplay, my recommendation is Storm of the Century by Stephen King. This one was published by Pocket Books in 1999 and definitely targeted towards adults. In this book, good will face off against evil during the storm of the century. In Westerns, my recommendation is Tombstone by Matt Braun. This was published by Pinnacle Books in 1983. Technically, it's the 3rd book featuring a main character, but you do not have to read them all. In fact, I haven't, and I loved it. This book is an interesting twist on the story of Doc Holliday and the Earp brothers. And lastly, in the genre of poetry, subgenre young adult contemporary, I recommend Burned by Ellen Hopkins. This was published by Margaret K. McElderry Books in 2006. It's a contemporary young adult story told entirely through poetry, and the format itself is genius. So my other various genre recommendations that you don't want to miss: in the category of romance, Hearts, Strings, and Other Breakable Things; in the category of horror, Storm of the Century; in the category of Western, Tombstone; and in the category of poetry, Burned. Okay, that's it for me and my 2019 book recommendations, otherwise known as books you don't want to miss. Drop a comment to let me know if you agree with any of these awesome recommendations. Hit subscribe and tap that little bell so you know when I'm back. Keep plotting the path to your dreams, and I will see you next time. Bye!